Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in the world, welcome back to the Caring Economy with me, Toby Usnik. So today we have the privilege of speaking with Graham McMillan. He's president of the Visa Foundation. Yes, Visa is in the credit card that you all know so well. Graham is a leader in corporate philanthropy and driving financial inclusion and economic empowerment worldwide. With year-end charitable donations top of mind, there's no better time to explore how corporations can make the meaningful impact that we know Visa is doing. So, Graham, with no further ado, welcome to the Caring Economy.
Toby, thanks for having me. Nice to meet you and look forward to the conversation.
So, Graham, we always begin the show by asking our guests to give us 2 or 3 minute digest of their life story. So, give us a little narrative about Graham.
I hail from well, I guess from a birthplace standpoint, from the state of California, which makes a lot of sense if you're employed by Visa, given our global headquarters there, but actually raised in New Jersey, which is actually where you find me today. I've really spent most of my life really in New Jersey, which it's just such a culturally diverse place. It's incredibly dense from a population standpoint.
Mhm.
It has an incredible history. It's kind of a cauldron of energy and exposure. And I think to a degree that probably informed my choices and where I've gone and where I've come from. But it's a place I say I come from with pride.
How did you go from high school to where you are today?
I went to a terrific institution for college called Colby College in Maine.
Yeah.
In the reality of going to more of the classic liberal arts kind of experience, smaller college, New England town kind of thing. Colby really just delivered that and had its own kind of unique history, allowing women to attend, and just a really interesting history. Elijah Paris Lovejoy, who has a long history of course, as you would know, in journalism, was actually an alum, and they have a famous journalism award that's given. So it's kind of like that classic Maine fierce independence,
Party.
forward-looking, kind of
Yes.
slightly puritanical, hard work, hard play, the whole thing. And I just, in many ways, Colby, between my personal relationships and really, I would say the second half of my academic career, made me who I am today. I had a professor, Toby, named Jim Webb, and the course I took. I want to say it was my senior year because I want to say it was like a seminar thing and it was a big, thesis, and the whole exercise was around ecological change in human history and how that change was caused by frequently people, and that led to seismic shifts over the course of history. And I just, for me, was the unlock to say, wow, there are patterns and there are things that are happening out there that are far bigger than this tiny little campus that I'm on, or the little town that I grew up in, or even this really interesting place called New Jersey. And that was the spark. And I remember taking that course in my particular thesis, which when I found it a few months ago when I was cleaning up the basement. Boy, it was pretty terrible writing, I'll be honest with you. But the interesting kind of through line was it was around ecological change, of course, but in Ethiopia, and why I chose Ethiopia. The subject I chose was around how the capital had changed over many centuries because of, in fact, the need to use wood to build all the buildings, and it was kind of like these patterns that I referenced. It was just fascinating, and I happened to be in an event earlier this fall, and I ran into, or I met, I should say, a government official from the government of Ethiopia, and I shared with her this thesis, and she was fascinated that some kid from New Jersey to write about it. It's one of those things that you look back and you kind of laugh, but you say, actually, that was a foundational moment for my intellectual curiosity about the bigger world. I was very lucky. My father worked in international shipping, sort of containers and ports and things of that nature. So I'd always get inspired by he'd be leaving to go to the airport to travel to some place somewhere in the world. And it would always fascinate me to come back with the currency and he'd share, or the passport stamps.
Yeah.
It's like, what is that? What does that mean? Who's there? What's happening in that city or that country? That was the original inspiration, but the additional curiosity around why some people have the privilege of choice, of being comfortable, of a roof over their head, food on the table, clothing on their back, actually was inspired by New Jersey. the convenience of being able to hop on the train, New Jersey Transit, zoom right into New York. And gosh, how many times have I done that? And when I was a kid, I didn't really understand why, when I got on the train here in Morristown, when you looked out the window, it looked a certain way. But the further you got along the line and the closer you got to the city, the view out the window changed pretty significantly.
Mhm.
But I never had gotten off the train. And it was actually my first job coming out of what I should say internship,
Mhm.
coming out of Colby, back at a certain point when it was not guaranteed that you would have email as part of your job. So you can, I'm sure, appreciate what that era was like. I worked in Newark, in the Newark public school system.
Wow.
And this was for Helen Keller International, which was the first organization that I had the opportunity to work for professionally. And I got off the train, Newark Broad Street. I would go to junior high schools and middle schools, and we were providing eyeglasses, prescription eyeglasses, to kids ages roughly 10 to 14 for very specific reasons on the spot in the classroom to unlock their potential because they couldn't see the blackboard. And having gotten off that train, my perception of the world was no longer about what was far over the horizon in Malaysia or in Brazil. It was
Here in my backyard.
backyard. Exactly. And that was the big question that I continue to try to answer to this day. I haven't answered it, by the way.
How did you pick that in that sector, that job, or who picked you?
I wanted to be an architect, believe it or
Okay.
not. That was my original dream job. And then I was lucky enough to do a kind of a summer school apprenticeship, and I learned very quickly I was not ready for the test. In all fairness to Colby, and frankly to the career that I've chosen, there wasn't certainly back then a clear pathway. It was this vague notion of doing quote unquote development work because I wanted to really focus internationally. And it wasn't until Helen Keller that I realized domestically at home. And I didn't, the word service and the intention of that word didn't have the meaning then that it does now,
Absolutely.
but
Absolutely.
it was, who am I to not give whatever talent, time, effort, energy I can give when I've been given enough to be who I am? A family, a friend happened to work at Helen Keller International, and she had heard of my interest and said, "I'll give you an internship for the summer if we can make it happen. I need your help actually not only launching this new program called Child Sight, the one I described before in Newark and a few other locations in the New York area, but in fact, they had been invited by the Indian Health Service to actually launch a program in New Mexico. And I was asked to go out and identify or do the research and then maybe identify what community, what tribe we would partner with. And so here I go, I get on a plane and I fly out to Albuquerque and went out to the Zuni Pueblo, the Acoma Pueblo, went to Navajo Nation and just, wow, what is it? Super interesting public health education. Again, this is glasses, young people, but then you're talking about a government institution and the Indian Health Service with all of the history that goes into that. New Mexico culturally being so fascinating. And I'm like, the fact that they trusted me, this 21-year-old, to go out and do this. And I was just like, wow, this is great. And Helen Keller International, which is still a tremendous organization with an incredible history, it's 100 plus years old, founded by Miss Keller herself, an incredible story behind its founding, related to the Lusitania and a wine merchant in New York. It was just the perfect mixture for a young 20-year-old to go learn, for me, get inspired to want to make a career out of it
Mhm.
ultimately. There was intentionality in timing of being in either a role and or an organization. And that's been actually quite consistent since Helen Keller days, 25 plus years ago, which is to say I've always been a builder. And I've wanted to be both in roles and in organizations that were not only building themselves, that were trying to build something bigger in the space, for lack of a better word. That pattern has remained consistent. And so taking that point, one of the things that drove me crazy about my first jobs or roles at Helen Keller was I really didn't like raising money. I actually was pretty good at it, but why I didn't like it wasn't the lack of connection and the pursuit and the engagement and all of that. I love that. And it's very quantifiable. I appreciated all of that, but it was the idiosyncrasies, the lack of predictability and unreliability of philanthropic capital. And I took that kind of pain point and I said to myself two things. One, I decided to go to NYU Wagner to get a graduate degree there and use that as a pivot to get into a tremendous organization, a startup that is now called Vision Spring. I had known the founder of Vision Spring from Helen Keller days, and a tremendous gentleman named Jordan Caslow. He had this vision, pardon the pun, of creating an organization and a business model that would essentially address the hundreds of millions of people that live around the world that don't have access to affordable eye care, especially eyeglasses. In particular, at that time, reading glasses. In the United States, we can go to CVS or Walgreens or whatever pharmacy or retail store and airport, whatever, pick up a pair of readers, a few bucks, or if you want to get fancy, maybe 40, $50. If you want to get really fancy, more than that. But in many places around the world, the market failed. And what was really interesting in this case is Jordan had this vision of training women entrepreneurs to start their own businesses, or what we call them micro franchises, to sell these glasses in their communities at a price point that allowed them to make money, allowed our organization to make money. And then in theory, you had a market-based solution that allowed you to scale.
Mhm.
And that to me was that was it. That was like, wow, you mean you can actually harness the power of business, give people the dignity of earning their own money, solve a public health education crisis, and maybe even, you know,
Make a
change
profit.
the market. And I will say, thankfully, because I left the organization and far more capable leadership came in, Vision Spring is thriving and has sold on the order of tens of millions of pairs of glasses around the world now. And it's really one of the true pioneers of the social enterprise movement, for lack of a better word. I was fascinated by market forces, the power of finance and capital. I still believe in the dignity of people to have a choice, and that certainly sort of policy conditions were important, but if you just unlock the power of the market and of choice and you put dignity at the center, good things can happen. But the financing of these business models was broken. And I got really interested in how do you finance and fund this. And around that time, this theory, or this term, I should say, of impact investing had emerged.
Yep.
And I took that with me and have taken that with me to where we are today. Fast forward, I knew I didn't have the skills to sit down with a bunch of finance professionals and business professionals. I was a development impact person, so to speak. And
Mhm.
so I went to business school, and graduated business school in 2009. Tremendous time to be looking for a job, by the way, if you remember that era.
Yes, I do.
And I got very, very lucky and met an amazing person named Brandy McHale, who hired me to come work at Citigroup in their foundation. And so I wanted to go from running an organization and building. I was employee number 2 at Vision Spring, and it was amazingly rewarding, but exhausting. I wanted to get into a portfolio, and that allowed me to get into a portfolio role. And frankly, Toby, since then, I've not gone back because it's much harder to run an organization doing the work on the ground. I say this jokingly because I do feel that the people that actually do the work are the heroes and deserve the recognition. The capital allocators get too much of the spotlight because they've got capital, and that capital has some agency and power to it. But at the end of the day, and I've done this now 15 years, capital allocation and in different forms, our job is to pick the winners and to support those that struggle. It's not to claim that we know what we're doing beyond what they do. And that's the privilege that I've had now for 15 years, either at Citigroup or at the Ford Foundation, or now more recently at Visa Foundation. When Visa reached out and said, we've established a foundation, we know what we want to do, but we really need somebody to come in and help us do it.
Mhm.
And it's not just in isolation of the foundation, it's actually a part of a larger effort to build out a function that is putting purpose and impact at the core of what Visa is trying to do to drive value for its stakeholders. And that function being called social impact, where we're harnessing the power and the capabilities of the business to really have an opportunity to drive economic growth, an opportunity around the world, and that the foundation would be an engine of a lot of that activity. Oh, by the way, focused on supporting entrepreneurs. And we had at that time $400 million in capital. So we had an endowment that we believed we could actually utilize beyond grant making. Those set of ingredients were
I
really
say
compelling.
no.
Yeah, and honestly, Toby, in my hubris, I was tired of being a program officer and I thought I could run the show better, better than all these other people I worked with over these years. Boy, did I learn a lesson.
I'm sure we'll hear that. I'm sure you have. We're gonna come back. Ladies and gentlemen, again today on the Caring Economy, we're honored to have Graham McMillan with us. He's the president of the Visa Foundation, where they're really focusing on corporate philanthropy is driving financial inclusion and economic empowerment. To that point, Graham, I wanted to ask you, can you give us a little overview of the foundation?
Yeah, so we are a kind of the classic example of a U.S. corporate philanthropy. We're absolutely a part of Visa. We really exist to drive two things. One, the work, the mission, but also, of course, to enhance Visa's reputation with a range of different stakeholders. Those stakeholders being either the 30,000 employees that I get to call colleagues, or a range of external stakeholders around the world. Visa, as you know, is very much a global company with a tremendously interesting history on its own, by the way. And that I didn't really understand until I got to Visa, but now that I've been there, it's actually, I think, the engine that gives us the most opportunity for the greatest impact going forward. Fundamentally, our purpose is to uplift everyone everywhere through economic mobility. It aligns to Visa's purpose, which is to uplift everyone everywhere by being the best way to pay and be paid. And our previous CEO established that purpose with the executive committee. And it really aligns fundamentally to what our value proposition is as a foundation, that economic opportunity and the aspiration of economic mobility, that you may be where you are today, but with access to a job or an ability to start or own a business, to have opportunity to be educated, et cetera. Those are drivers of mobility and opportunity. And Visa is fundamentally an aspirational brand. And we, as a foundation, believe with the mission statement that we have that we can facilitate that in three core ways. And our signature work is focused really around economic opportunity through financial inclusion. And the leverage point that we have chosen is specifically small micro businesses. Really, that's where 70–80% of our capital has been allocated in support of. Now, of course, we don't work with them directly. We work through partners. We also recognize that we have, as I mentioned before, 30,000 employees around the world, and they want to be proud of working for a company that cares about the communities in which they live. So from a place-based standpoint, we have a community impact portfolio that really thinks about that.
Mhm.
But what's an interesting kind of twist on that is we actually want the employees to help us identify what they think are the critical needs in those communities through the Visa Foundation Gives program, which is what we call it. We actually ask our employees in those offices to vote on the issue areas that they think are most critical and maybe most aligned to where Visa can make a difference. So then once that issue area gets identified, we then in turn provide funding to a local community-based, meaning the foundation.
Is that done annually, that sort of voting,
It's
or?
done definitely annually and in every region in which we work every year. So I think we're upwards now of 15 different cities around the world that we've done. But for instance, we have worked with a range of organizations, including like HISPA in Miami, that helps support education needs for the local community, to basically the WWF in Dubai, addressing environmental issues. So it's really just a tremendous set of opportunities and program where we've worked with tremendous organizations. And then third, of course, for really most any certainly global corporate philanthropy, we respond to needs regarding crisis, conflict, disaster through our humanitarian assistance work. And frankly, Toby, when I joined Visa and took this role on in 2019, I would not have envisioned how significant that set of activities would be, for all the reasons that you know and that your listeners can appreciate. That's been really quite challenging, incredibly rewarding, and very inspiring. because it kind of represents the best of Visa. We are not a humanitarian assistance organization, first and foremost, but we recognize that we have an obligation, we have a commitment to the communities that we live in, and that community is also global, right? So
Yeah.
we've done a tremendous amount of work in that regard. The
You,
fourth
you,
piece, I'll just say very briefly, although it's not programmatic per se, but it is employee matching. So kind of full scope. The team is around 10 people or so, but we are fundamentally plugged into the company. Our job really is to be the best stewards of that goodwill, as well as stewards from a fiduciary responsibility standpoint and how we allocate that capital responsibly.
Very cool. Which is a big world out there. I wonder, you'd mentioned Ford before, and I'm reminded of what Darren and you all did vis-a-vis Detroit, where I lived in the suburbs as a kid, and JP Morgan partnering with them and others. How do you at the foundation divvy up? Like, is there a certain allotment for each region of the world?
Yeah, yes. It's been an evolution. So when we first started, and boy, again, when we first started, it was a very different time, 2019. And I say when I joined, in all fairness, that I had colleagues who had done legwork and had established the foundation and done about 2 years worth of work. But we really started to accelerate around then. And it was really harnessing the capital, the endowment that we had had at that time. So the 400 million or so, applying it to this focus on small and micro businesses, um, in addition to the other areas that I mentioned, and then actually adding some additional elements beyond the grant making that we do. We also invest out of the endowment, and we went intentionally to do that because we felt that it was what small micro businesses really needed. And it was also an efficient way to utilize our capital because if we were smart in the way that we invested, not only would we be able to drive impact, in theory, those investments would perform well enough to recycle that capital to perpetuate the activity. And it was also prudent because the way that the endowment had initially been invested was actually, it was not diversified enough, frankly. So in addressing that, and then from an impact standpoint, being very intentional to think about women as business owners and women as investors, in addition to sort of broader underrepresented founders, we said we have an opportunity to grow the market. Right? This is fundamentally about economic growth and growth that creates new opportunity. And if we can be the catalyst to demonstrate that you can identify best in class companies in markets that are really driving innovation because they see an opportunity that others don't, that's the real unlock. So it's kind of you had the set of conditions in place, the capital, the asset allocation model, the investment policy statement, the governance, the investment, like all and the critical infrastructure. And then you have to have this alignment to say, well, what's relevant for us, to allocate this capital the right way. Initially, we were like the new kid on the block. We did not have existing relationships, so we kind of went to big global organizations that had kind of local networks, and we did that, I think, quite effectively. And we made a $200 million commitment in 2020 as part of our way to help companies and communities impacted by COVID, called Equitable Access. And we've made that commitment. We continue to pay out against those commitments, but that was a $200 million 5-year commitment. But it was really kind of broad brushed, high level. Where we are today, though, is recognizing we can't be all things to all people, and as I like to say, we can't spread the peanut butter. It doesn't allow us because it's a big world and there's a lot of need, and we're in a lot of places. In working with our board, we basically said, let's be relevant in critical markets where there's a need, where there are a set of conditions to be successful, and where Visa has a capacity and a vested long-term interest. And so we've identified 9 sort of priority markets that allow us to allocate capital
Mhm.
in a very localized way, ideally to local organizations or local funds from an investment standpoint, where our colleagues who don't work for the foundation, who don't spend 100% of their time thinking about the foundation, have a sense of ownership and, in fact, develop their own relationships with that work in those markets. And that's really what we've been focused on now for the past 2 years.
That's all with female entrepreneurs in the programming in those 9. areas?
That's the intent. I wouldn't say 100% of it because
Most.
depending on how you count it, but certainly the vast majority are either the fund managers that we invest into, who in turn invest into companies, and we have about 150 portfolio companies that we've invested in through those funds. These are big markets, obviously. That's the pattern. There's two per the five regions, except of course North America, because the U.S. we stay focused on that. Essentially, Nigeria. This was some years ago. We identified a tremendously capable and really inspiring woman named Adesua Rhodes. And she had been a banker with JP Morgan for a number of years in London. And she's Nigerian, of course, and went back to Lagos and said, I believe there's a huge market opportunity. And I want to basically raise a venture capital fund that I can invest into these high growth opportunities. And this was 2019, 2020, and wound up that she got a friends and family round, but she hadn't been able to raise institutional. And we were the first institutional money in. And I think she, at that time, she was trying to raise 30 or 40 million US. And she has subsequently raised that money. She's on her second fund. And one of the cool companies that she's invested in is a company called Ami Retail, which, according to the FT, is the fastest growing company in sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah, it's so cool because she saw the need, because of our strategy and our intent and the availability of our capital and the timing, it just worked out. We subsequently invested in the second fund, I'd add, which is an important signal. But one example, or what Omni Retail does, is it's basically informal kiosks that allow people. So think of it's almost like a digital catalog. Like when you're walking the streets of Lagos, you need a set of items. You can go to these kiosks and essentially order them for yourself, and it facilitates local economic development growth because a lot of these items are actually produced locally, and it's really about consumer access, which speaks to the broader story of Visa. So it's a really interesting example of how we took our investment capital, applied it to advancing women-led businesses, women-led funds in a critical market. We have a number of other examples. Colombia is another example. We have an investment in a fund called AWA Capital, and an interesting company they just invested in called VAS, VAAS, allows borrowers to essentially digitize and verify assets so that they can essentially get asset-backed financing to grow their businesses. Which you see, like that seems so, mundane, but when you're in a marketplace that doesn't have that, the lending is locked up. And so it's just seeing those patterns and those opportunities. And again, for us to be able to identify tremendous funds led by tremendous investors has really accelerated our ability to support small micro businesses in the way that
Yeah,
we have.
I would think that others are following your lead, which makes me wonder, do you have any sort of prognostications of, say, the next 5 or 10 years? Maybe for Visa Foundation, but more broadly, just for corporate philanthropy. Are we going to see more of the sort of impact investing and less of the old school sort of grant writing?
One of the measures, and it's just a measure for us to help us think. We like to play well with others. We're not trying to do things on our own. And I think in a marketplace, in commerce, frequently in business, different actors come together, and there's sort of a harmony in coming together when there's a sort of a purpose to grow a business in a certain way. And actors, it's organizing forces that make a lot of sense. And the signal for you to share about our data is like, we know that we've helped attract an additional $2 billion of investment into the funds that we've invested. And I am not claiming it was because of us, but it
But
was
you are a
because,
seal of approval.
yeah, well, and I will say, particularly when you're dealing with maybe other actors that don't have necessarily the brand recognition that Visa does, and certainly for Arua is a perfect example, or Beacon Fund in Southeast Asia, when Visa's brand is associated with an investment, it does attract. But I will say it's the combined efforts and diligence of all those investors that led to the 2 billion that I think is what's meaningful. But if you think about the demand or the need for further investment, it far exceeds $2 billion. You got to add a lot more zeros to that, hundreds of billions. And that, to your question, I don't know that impact investing is the solution to scale. And there's a lot of talk, rightly or wrongly, and depending, and I would say it's more probably on the public market side than it is on the private market side. More capital has come in to claim that it is impact investing. And my job isn't to count that. Like, I don't know. What I want to see is more funds in these types of markets getting more capital in efficient and effective ways so that businesses like Omni Retail or Voss get capital efficiently. And these local capital markets, as you know, Toby, they're not there yet. And if anything, our capital, and I think we would call it impact investing, is in some respects the risk capital that will show the way for maybe more institutional capital over time. That kind of continuum is what I think we have started to see.
Yeah.
But the pace of growth is not there yet. But if it performs, it should attract additional capital if it performs. And I will tell you, we're really encouraged by what we're seeing. Talk to me in 5 years, because a lot of this venture and private equity, the tenor and the timing of it, we'll see what that looks like. But I I would like to see philanthropy use its financial assets far more efficiently than what it does. But as the literature conversations I know you've had, there are incentives that are misaligned to being, and policies, frankly, to being able to do that.
Yeah.
And it would be nice to see that change sooner rather than later.
Well, I definitely going to follow up with you. I've got so many more questions around the great wealth transfer and the role of crypto and a new presidential administration, so many different things. So, out of respect for your time, I do want to just ask one last question and then we'll have a future conversation, which is your pearls of wisdom that you've gleaned in life. You talked a little bit at the beginning about recognizing patterns, but do you have any sort of mantra or regular advice you give to those young people and even those who are sort of disrupted in their careers and older?
I mean, purpose is in the eye of the beholder, and it's not for me to tell you what your purpose is. I'm not even still certain what my own purpose is, but what I know is that I go to bed at night not questioning what career I've been lucky enough to have. The harder question is, well, have I been effective? Have I made a difference? Nobody's going to care how much capital I allocated. My intent is, yes, I am trying to turn the dial for better.
Yep.
The most fundamental way that I believe that I will have made a difference is not anything to do with the dollars, the programs, the reports, the data, any of that. It's the people. This team works harder than any team that I've ever worked with, and they're so smart and so good as people. They are given opportunities to build something that not only will benefit whatever it is we do today, but actually will have a multiplier dividend that will far exceed in the long run. So it's really the power of who they are and what they will become that I am most proud of being a part of bringing together. And that's what is the only thing that I care about. And whether or not I was a good husband and a good father and friend.
That's amazing.
That's it. That's what I want on my tombstone, Toby.
Well, I do think you'll have that if you want it. I do think that you're a living example of empowering people that you work with to be their best. And I think that everyone has leadership in them, but you don't always have a manager who cultivates that in you or brings it out. Great brands do that. Great brands invest in their people. And I would hazard a guess that your team of any different age, they all have that sense of purpose, which so many young people in particular crave right now when they're out looking for the job, even though they don't know what the job is. So the best way I look at it is nobody's cornered the market on good ideas. And if you can get everyone and anyone on your team contributing, you're going to have better chances of success than everyone looking to you as the boss, right?
Well, and to have a voice, and there's a currency in your voice that matters, and the opportunity to feel comfortable that you can express that, push back, have a different opinion, respectfully and collaboratively, like that. That's just the generative stuff that matters,
Mhm.
and the trust.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I would say, as also a graduate of a small liberal arts college, the role of the arts and sciences, liberal arts education today, I think, is really better preparation for the future. of AI and everything else. It's got to be human centered. It's got to be for a higher purpose, and it has to be humane in the most basic sense. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank again Graham McMillan for being with us today. He's the president of the Visa Foundation and just a wonderful human being as well. So, Graham, let's have another conversation another day and wishing you a great holiday season.
Toby, I look forward to it, and let's get together in the city.